What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus was only the last chapter of a much greater story? A story that began long before Bethlehem, stretching back through thousands of years, across ancient civilizations and forgotten ages. What if the man who walked the shores of Galilee had lived not once, but many times before, each life carefully preparing him for an ultimate mission, unlike any other in human history? Has this ever happened to you, where you feel a strange connection to a time, a place, or a figure you've never met, as if part of your soul remembers something beyond this lifetime? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. For over 4 decades, between 1901 and 1944, America's most documented psychic, Edgar Cayce, entered deep trance states and gave more than 14,000 recorded readings that continue to astonish researchers to this day. In them, he spoke not only of health, spiritual growth, and the unseen forces guiding human destiny, but also of something even more extraordinary, the revelation that the soul we now know as Jesus the Christ had lived before, at least 30 times before, each incarnation contributing to the formation of the spiritual consciousness that would one day transform the world. These were not random lives, nor disconnected events. Cayce described them as a spiritual curriculum, where each incarnation was like a classroom, offering lessons in compassion, wisdom, leadership, and divine obedience. Imagine the idea that the life in Bethlehem was not the beginning of Jesus' story, but rather its grand culmination. What you're about to hear challenges traditional narratives, but it also opens a door to a deeper, richer understanding of spiritual evolution, one that suggests the path Jesus walked is the same path we are all walking, lifetime after lifetime. But before we begin, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. This journey is about more than just learning history. It's about feeling it, connecting to it, and perhaps realizing that you've been part of it before. Cayce spoke of the Christ soul as a timeless consciousness, appearing in different forms across vast stretches of history. Some of these lives were in the pages of the Bible, others in civilizations long buried beneath the sands of time. Each was marked by a clear purpose: to prepare for a mission of universal love, a mission that would eventually take the form of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a bold claim, one that invites both curiosity and reflection. Could it be that the same soul guiding humanity through ancient Atlantis, walking with God as Enoch, blessing Abraham as Melchizedek, rising to power in Egypt as Joseph, and leading a people into the promised land as Joshua, was the very soul that would one day teach on the hills of Galilee? This is not just about theology. It's about the possibility that consciousness transcends a single lifetime, and that every experience, no matter how distant in time, shapes who we ultimately become. And if that's true for Jesus, what might it mean for you? Have you ever felt that certain challenges, gifts, or even fears were carried over from somewhere else, some other existence? We're about to step into a story that spans over 100,000 years, moving through lost continents, sacred temples, and the most mysterious corners of the ancient world. It's a journey where spiritual evolution is not just a theory, but a lived experience. One life building upon the lessons of another, weaving a tapestry of wisdom and love that would one day change the course of human history. In the next part, we'll uncover the first of these remarkable incarnations, a life that began not in the deserts of Judea, but in the luminous realm of Atlantis, where the soul that would become Jesus took its first steps toward the mission that would redefine humanity forever. Subscribe and stay connected. There's so much more to discover, and I'd love to share it with you. According to Cayce, the story truly begins in a time so distant it feels almost like myth, yet he spoke of it with the certainty of someone recalling a vivid memory. Over 100,000 years ago, long before the lands we know today had taken shape, there was Atlantis. Not the romanticized version scattered through popular culture, but a vast, thriving civilization where the laws of spirit and the laws of matter still danced closely together. And at the center of this early chapter was a being known as Amelius, the first expression of the divine mind in human affairs, a consciousness not yet bound by flesh. Amelius wasn't born in the way we think of birth. This was a soul entering the earth plane in a luminous form, a bridge between the unseen and the material. Cayce described him as the living embodiment of the Logos, the divine pattern, manifesting to guide humanity at a critical turning point. Atlantis at this stage was not only a place of advanced knowledge, but also of dangerous experiments with the forces of creation. Some souls, newly descended from higher realms, became entangled in their own misuse of free will, altering their forms and locking themselves into strange, distorted bodies. These were not simply symbolic tales. They were, in Cayce's account, the behind-the-scenes reality of how consciousness first began struggling with the weight of material existence. The situation demanded a leader, someone capable of seeing far beyond the present crisis, and this is where Amelius stepped forward. Rather than rescuing these souls by force, he chose a path of transformation, reshaping the very framework of human evolution so that spirit could fully inhabit matter without losing its connection to the divine. It was here, Cayce said, that the pattern of the human body as we know it today was first formed, not just a biological form, but a vessel designed to carry the highest vibration of love and awareness. This was the seed of what would, many lifetimes later, become the mission of Jesus, creating a way for humanity to experience the material world without becoming enslaved by it. The decisions made in this ancient era carried a profound impact, rippling across millennia, setting into motion a spiritual journey that would weave through multiple incarnations. In Atlantis, Amelius laid the foundation not only for human form, but for the possibility of spiritual awakening within it. What fascinates me most about this moment is the mindset behind it. Amelius understood that real change comes not from imposing order, but from aligning the very structure of life with higher truth. It's a principle that still applies today, in leadership, in personal growth, in every choice that shapes our own path. Sometimes the most powerful transformation begins invisibly, embedded deep within the framework of our being. Cayce's readings describe this as the first Adam, not as a man of clay in a garden, but as the original blueprint of humanity's potential. And here's where the hidden truth becomes almost poetic. The Christ soul's earliest mission was not to preach, not to rule, but to design, a work of creation that was at once practical and profoundly sacred. This act of setting the pattern would echo into every future life, each incarnation building on the lessons of the last. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the journey from Atlantis to the historical, Jesus passes through remarkable lifetimes, each one sharpening a specific quality, each one a chapter in a long preparation for the greatest spiritual mission in history. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." Cayce described Atlantis at that time as a civilization both magnificent and deeply troubled, a place where immense knowledge coexisted with dangerous ambition. In its golden halls, souls once radiant with light had begun experimenting with the very fabric of life itself, bending the laws of creation for personal gain. This misuse of free will carried consequences no one could fully predict. The first wave of souls to descend into the material world found themselves caught in a slow, spiraling trap, their spiritual essence merging with the raw energies of matter before they understood how to control it. The result was a distortion of form, beings that were neither fully human nor fully animal, strange hybrids that reflected the imbalance within their consciousness. It was a hidden truth that few could face. These grotesque shapes were not punishments from some external force, but the natural outcome of decisions made in ignorance of the greater laws. And it was here that Amelius appeared, not as a conqueror, but as a guide who saw the potential beyond the chaos. He understood that the real rescue would not come from simply pulling these souls out of their condition, but from creating a way for them to step forward on their own, into a higher state of being. If this kind of content speaks to you, consider subscribing so we can explore even more together. Leading what Cayce called the Sons of God, Amelius set out to redirect the course of human evolution. This was not just a spiritual mission, it was a profound act of design, a recalibration of the physical and energetic patterns that make life possible. The aim was nothing less than to create a body capable of housing divine awareness, without collapsing under the weight of material existence. Every decision in this process carried enormous impact, shaping the blueprint that would define humanity for ages to come. Behind the scenes of what we call history, Cayce suggested, this was the first great act of conscious transformation on Earth. It was an intricate balancing act, honoring the freedom of each soul while guiding the entire species toward a form that could express love, wisdom, and higher purpose. The human body as we know it, with its unique balance of physical strength and mental capacity, was the result of this vision. It was, in essence, a sacred vessel, intentionally crafted so that spirit could thrive in matter without being consumed by it. This moment marked the beginning of a journey that would echo across thousands of years. The Christ soul, in the form of Amelius, was already learning the mindset that would define every future incarnation, that true leadership comes not from domination, but from alignment with a greater plan. It was a lesson in patience, in seeing beyond immediate results, and in trusting that the seeds of change planted now would bear fruit long after the planter had moved on. Amelius's work in Atlantis was more than the rescue of a few. It was the opening of a door for all of humanity, a decision that allowed the soul's light to one day shine through the limitations of flesh. And even though this chapter would fade into myth, the pattern he established became the foundation for the mission that would eventually unfold in the life of Jesus. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because the next stage of this journey takes us into a life where the Christ soul began translating this cosmic vision into teachings that could be preserved for generations. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Cayce painted the figure of Amelius as far more than a savior of a lost age. He was the architect of what it means to be human. By shaping the physical and spiritual framework that would allow divine essence to dwell within matter, Amelius became what Cayce called the first Adam. This was not a title of ego or ownership, but of responsibility. He set the original template for human consciousness, a pattern that would echo through the ages. Every choice made in that moment, every adjustment to the design of the human form, was a decision that carried unimaginable impact, influencing the destiny of billions of souls yet to come. And yet, this was only the beginning. Once the structure was in place, the next step was to live within it, to experience firsthand the challenges, limitations, and opportunities it offered. The Christ soul would have to walk the path that had been prepared, proving that the framework was not just a divine theory, but a living, breathing reality. That's when the journey moved from creation to participation. The story of Atlantis faded into the realm of legend, and the soul that had been Amelius emerged again in a world far more familiar to us, yet still charged with mystery and spiritual depth. This time, he appeared as Enoch, a figure whose life stands out in ancient scripture for a reason that continues to intrigue scholars and seekers alike. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Cayce's readings revealed that Enoch was not only a man of great spiritual purity, but also a teacher whose wisdom came directly from the realms beyond the physical. In this life, the mission shifted from designing the human vessel to guiding its occupants, helping them remember their origin and their purpose. Enoch's role was to serve as a living bridge between heaven and earth, embodying what it meant to hold divine consciousness while navigating the demands of material life. This was the early groundwork for the kind of presence Jesus would later bring into the world, a balance of human experience and unbroken connection to the source. But Enoch didn't just teach, he documented. According to Cayce, he was the author of some of the earliest spiritual texts ever written, preserving truths that would resurface thousands of years later, long after his own time had passed. Join the journey, hit subscribe, and keep uncovering these hidden layers of history and spirit with me. This act of recording wisdom was no small detail. It was a strategic decision, born of the understanding that human memory is fragile and that the hidden truths of existence must be protected from the erosion of time. The writings, attributed to Enoch, were seeds planted for future generations, ensuring that the message of spiritual transformation would survive even in ages of darkness. Cayce pointed out that Enoch's departure from this world, without experiencing death, was not simply a miraculous event, but a demonstration of the potential within the human framework first established in Atlantis. It showed that the body could be a vehicle for the soul's return to higher realms without the need for decay or destruction. This was a revelation, an early glimpse of the destiny that lay at the end of the soul's long journey, a return to perfect unity with the divine, fully conscious and fully alive. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next appearance of the Christ soul would merge spiritual authority with humble service in a way that would shape the course of sacred history. Put down, I'm also on this path. Cayce's account of Enoch becomes even more striking when you realize that what he described decades earlier found unexpected confirmation in the modern world. In 1947, long after Cayce's passing, the Dead Sea Scrolls emerged from the shadows of history, hidden in caves near Qumran for nearly 2,000 years. Among them were texts quoting the Book of Enoch, preserving passages that echoed with the same spiritual depth Cayce had attributed to this ancient patriarch. It was as if the past itself had reached forward to validate the story. These discoveries were more than archaeological treasures. They were a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of finding its way back into the light. Enoch's writings were not simple moral guidelines. They were maps of consciousness. They explored the structure of the heavens, the nature of divine law, and the path by which humanity could return to its original harmony with the source. He was not speaking to one generation, but to all of them, encoding his message so that those with eyes to see would recognize it across the ages. In this way, he ensured that the seed of transformation he had planted could survive droughts of faith and floods of forgetfulness. What fascinates me about this moment in the journey is how deliberate it feels. Enoch understood that the human tendency to forget would be one of the greatest challenges to spiritual growth. So instead of relying solely on spoken word or personal influence, he left behind a tangible legacy, written truth that could be rediscovered when humanity was ready. It's a mindset rooted in foresight, patience, and the quiet confidence that the right moment for revelation would eventually arrive. Even more intriguing is the connection to Jesus' own time. The New Testament itself contains a direct quote from the Book of Enoch in the letter of Jude, recognizing his words as prophecy. This thread, woven from the ancient past into the very fabric of Christian scripture, suggests an unbroken flow of wisdom running quietly behind the scenes of history. It reinforces the idea that the mission of the Christ soul was never about isolated acts, but about continuity, each life building upon the momentum of the last, carrying forward the same eternal purpose. If you've enjoyed this perspective, subscribing means you'll always be here when the next insight arrives. Cayce described Enoch's departure from the world not as death, but as an ascension into a higher state of awareness, what he called the throne chariot of divine consciousness. It was a living demonstration that the human framework could transcend its earthly limitations, that the body and spirit could align so completely with divine law that separation was no longer necessary. This wasn't just a personal victory. It was a signpost left for all humanity, showing what was possible when one lived in full alignment with higher truth. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next incarnation of the Christ soul would step into history not only as a spiritual guide but as both priest and king, merging sacred authority with humble service in a way that would leave an imprint on the spiritual practices we still recognize today. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Enoch's life was not just a sequence of holy acts. It was a living experiment in what it means to be fully human while remaining anchored in the divine. He walked through the world with the quiet certainty of someone who knew where he came from and where he was going, yet never used that awareness as a barrier between himself and others. His presence was proof that spiritual elevation did not require withdrawal from life, but rather a deeper participation in it. He taught that divine consciousness was not something distant to be reached after death, but a state that could be cultivated here and now, within the very fabric of daily living. Cayce portrayed Enoch as a guide who understood the fragile balance between spirit and matter, and who mastered the art of walking in both realms without losing himself to either. This was a profound shift in the mindset of the Christ soul. In Atlantis, Amelius had shaped the form. Now, as Enoch, he was learning to inhabit it fully, demonstrating how the human vessel could be aligned so precisely with higher truth that the physical world itself became an expression of the divine. It was a transformation of approach, moving from the cosmic architect to the embodied teacher. The hidden truth in Enoch's journey is that he did not just tell people to seek the kingdom of heaven, he showed them that it was already within. This teaching would later reappear in Jesus' own words, but here it was lived out centuries earlier, offering a model of integration rather than escape. It challenged the prevailing belief that closeness to God required isolation or the abandonment of earthly responsibilities. Instead, Enoch revealed that one could engage in the world, lead, work, teach, and still maintain an unbroken connection to the source. His ascension was not a spectacle for its own sake. It was a natural outcome of a life lived in full harmony with divine law. Cayce described it as a rising into the throne chariot of awareness, a return to higher dimensions without the interruption of death. For those who witnessed it, the impact was not just awe but the dawning realization that this was the destiny of every soul, to merge so completely with divine consciousness that separation dissolves entirely. This was the blueprint for spiritual liberation, not reserved for a chosen few, but embedded in the human design itself. The influence of Enoch's example did not fade. His life and departure planted a seed in the collective memory, a subtle reminder that the path back to divine unity was not only possible, but had already been walked. The Christ soul carried this knowledge forward, layering it over the lessons of creation and leadership from Atlantis, preparing for a future where authority, humility, and service would merge into one seamless expression. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because the next incarnation of the Christ soul would stand at the crossroads of kingship and priesthood, wielding spiritual authority not as a weapon, but as a sacred trust that would shape rituals still practiced today. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." Stepping out of the mysterious figure of Enoch, the Christ soul emerged again in an incarnation that blended earthly power with divine responsibility. Melchizedek, the priest-king of Salem. This was not merely a ruler presiding over a small kingdom. He was a living embodiment of spiritual authority seamlessly woven into the structures of leadership. In Abraham's time, his presence carried an almost otherworldly weight. He stood as both mediator between heaven and earth and as a guardian of the sacred, able to navigate the delicate balance between governing people and guiding souls. The image of Melchizedek, blessing Abraham with bread and wine, is more than a symbolic act preserved in Scripture. It was, according to Cayce, a deliberate spiritual imprint. In that simple yet profound moment, a ritual was seeded into human consciousness, one that would later reappear in the Last Supper as the central act of communion. The connection is not accidental. It is a thread running through centuries, linking ancient blessings to the heart of Christian practice. It's one of those hidden truths that, once seen, shifts the way you perceive history, not as separate stories, but as a continuous journey of transformation. Cayce also revealed that Melchizedek authored the Book of Job, one of the most profound explorations of suffering, resilience, and divine justice ever written. The language of Job does not shy away from the raw edges of human experience. It acknowledges pain, loss, and doubt, yet carries an unshakable undercurrent of trust in divine purpose. In writing it, Melchizedek was shaping the spiritual mindset that the Christ soul would later need, a depth of compassion born not from theory, but from the willingness to sit with the hardest questions of existence. The role of priest-king demanded more than wisdom. It required discipline and the ability to hold both authority and humility without letting one overpower the other. Melchizedek's reign was not about control, but stewardship, protecting the sacred traditions, fostering justice, and ensuring that leadership itself remained an act of service. This is where the Christ soul refined the skill of leading without ego, a lesson that would become central to Jesus' ministry centuries later. Behind the scenes, Melchizedek was also building the foundation for a community of spiritual seekers. Cayce spoke of him establishing the School of the Prophets, a place where knowledge was preserved and where those dedicated to divine service could be trained. Over time, this tradition would evolve into the Essene community, the very group that would later shelter and prepare Jesus for his mission. The foresight here is staggering. It shows that these incarnations were not isolated, but intricately connected, each one making decisions whose impact would ripple far beyond its own era. In this life, the Christ soul was learning to blend ritual with relationship, sacred symbolism with daily practice, and governance with grace. The bread and wine, the writings of Job, the training of disciples before they even knew their names. These were all pieces of a larger tapestry. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next incarnation would place the Christ soul in the midst of personal betrayal, political intrigue, and a test of forgiveness so profound that it would define the heart of future teachings. Put down, this makes sense to me. Melchizedek's time as priest-king was more than a historical footnote. It was a living preview of what the Christ soul would one day bring to its fullest expression. The act of offering bread and wine to Abraham was not a casual gesture. It was a deliberate spiritual transmission, embedding a pattern into the human story that would resurface centuries later in the upper room of Jerusalem. When Jesus broke bread and poured wine among his disciples, it was not an invention of that moment, but the flowering of a seed planted in Salem long before. The meaning was the same then as it would be later, a covenant, a reminder of unity between the divine and the human, a symbol of nourishment that was both physical and eternal. Cayce described this incarnation as a delicate training ground in balancing two forces that often pull in opposite directions, authority and service. As Melchizedek, the Christ soul held undeniable power, yet understood that leadership without humility becomes tyranny, and humility without strength becomes ineffectual. This was the hidden truth behind his reign. Every decision was weighed not for personal gain, but for the long-term well-being of those he served. It was a mindset that fused discipline with compassion, governance with grace. What makes this period so fascinating is how intentional it was. The bread and wine were more than sacred elements. They were tools of remembrance. Every time the ritual was repeated, it carried the echo of that first blessing, linking those who participated to a lineage of spiritual awakening that stretched far beyond their own lifetime. This is the behind-the-scenes continuity that Cayce's readings bring to light, seeing history not as scattered events, but as a carefully woven thread of purpose. In this role, the Christ soul also refined the art of living in two worlds at once. As a king, he was immersed in the practical realities of politics, resources, and protection. As a priest, he was constantly attuned to higher law, aware that every earthly action had spiritual consequences. Holding both positions demanded constant self-awareness and the ability to choose not what was easy or popular, but what aligned with the deeper design of the journey. Humility here did not mean self-effacement, it meant clarity of purpose. Melchizedek knew his role was to serve as a vessel, not as the source. That understanding allowed him to exercise authority without clinging to it, to lead without creating dependence, and to inspire without demanding devotion. These were qualities the Christ soul would need in even greater measure in the life of Jesus, when the balance between guiding others and letting them find their own path would become one of the greatest tests of the mission. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next life would immerse the Christ soul in a story of betrayal, resilience, and ultimate reconciliation, shaping the very heart of what would later become the teaching on forgiveness. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." Through the school of the prophets, Melchizedek planted a vision that would outlast kingdoms and empires. It wasn't just a place of learning. It was a sanctuary for those called to live in harmony with divine law, a hidden current of wisdom flowing quietly beneath the surface of history. Over generations, this community's teachings evolved, their discipline refined, until they became known as the Essenes, the very group that would one day shelter educate, and prepare Jesus for his public mission. It's one of those rare moments in the journey where you can see the continuity so clearly, as if the soul was laying out stepping stones far ahead of its own path. But as the threads of this purpose wove forward, the Christ soul stepped into a life of a very different texture. Gone were the royal halls and ceremonial blessings. This time, the path led into betrayal, exile, and a test of endurance that would carve the deepest lessons of compassion and forgiveness. In the land of Canaan, he was born as Joseph, son of Jacob, beloved yet envied by his brothers. From the earliest days, his ability to dream vividly and to interpret those dreams set him apart. It was both a gift and a burden, as his visions revealed truths others were not ready to hear. The turning point came when jealousy took root among his brothers. They sold him into slavery, a decision born in secrecy but with consequences that would ripple through nations. For most, this would have been the end of the journey, an irreversible descent into despair. But for Joseph, it became the crucible where strength of spirit was forged. Every setback, from false accusations to years in prison, was met not with bitterness, but with a steadfast trust that even unseen forces could be working for good. This mindset, the ability to see meaning where others saw only misfortune, was the hidden strength Joseph carried. It was more than resilience. It was a conscious choice to align with a higher design, even when the immediate evidence suggested abandonment. That perspective turned chains into preparation, isolation into refinement. And in the unfolding of events, it placed him exactly where he needed to be, in Pharaoh's court, interpreting dreams that would save Egypt from famine. The parallels to the future mission of Jesus are impossible to ignore. Both were rejected by their own. Both descended into a kind of symbolic death, and both rose to a position where they could offer life-giving sustenance. Joseph with grain for a starving land, Jesus with the bread of life for a spiritually hungry world. Yet, perhaps the most transformative moment in Joseph's life came not in his rise to power, but in the quiet, intimate decision to forgive. When those same brothers who betrayed him stood before him in need, he could have sought revenge. Instead, he offered reconciliation, choosing to heal the fracture rather than deepen it. This was the heart training the Christ soul needed, the lived experience of mercy that would later flow through every act of Jesus' ministry. It was learning that forgiveness is not weakness, but the highest form of strength, capable of breaking cycles of harm that power alone cannot touch. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because the next stage in the journey would test this capacity for divine alignment even further, placing the soul in a role where obedience to higher will was the only path through conflict. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Joseph's rejection by his brothers was more than a family dispute. It was the seed of a spiritual pattern that would repeat centuries later. The sting of being cast out by those closest to you is unlike any other wound, because it strikes at both trust and belonging. For Joseph, this fracture came early, shaping his understanding of loyalty, betrayal, and the fragile bonds that tie people together. Cayce's readings point to this as a deliberate preparation, a rehearsal for the moment when Jesus himself would be turned away by his own people, not because his mission lacked truth, but because truth often threatens the comfort of the familiar. The parallels didn't stop there. Both Joseph and Jesus stepped into the public expression of their missions at the age of 30, a detail too precise to be coincidence. For Joseph, 30 marked the transition from years of hidden preparation to a sudden rise into Pharaoh's service, where his ability to interpret dreams became the key to saving an entire nation. For Jesus, 30 was the threshold between a quiet life in Galilee and a ministry that would ignite transformation across the ancient world. In both lives, this age symbolized readiness, the moment when inner maturity met outer opportunity. But readiness did not mean ease. For Joseph, the journey to that position was marked by long periods of obscurity, where his gifts were unseen or even resented. There's a hidden truth here about timing. The path to impact often runs through seasons when recognition is absent, yet those very seasons forge the resilience needed to handle influence without losing oneself to it. In Pharaoh's court, Joseph's role demanded precision, compassion, and the ability to make decisions that affected millions, a responsibility that mirrored, in earthly terms, the spiritual weight Jesus would later carry. What stands out in Joseph's story is his ability to hold on to vision, even in the absence of visible progress. Whether in a prison cell or a palace, his mindset remained anchored in service to something greater than himself. That kind of steadiness is not born overnight. It is the result of consciously choosing, again and again, to see life through the lens of purpose rather than circumstance. This was the training ground for the Christ soul, learning that the true measure of leadership is not in the authority you hold, but in the lives you transform. Even the political and logistical skills Joseph mastered, managing resources during years of abundance and famine, held symbolic weight. They foreshadowed Jesus' role as a provider, not of grain, but of spiritual sustenance, offering the bread of life to those starved for meaning and connection. Both understood that provision was not merely about survival, but about restoration, restoring dignity, hope, and the possibility of a future. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next turn in the journey would place the Christ soul in a position where forgiveness was not a concept to be preached, but a decision to be lived, even toward those who had once sought to destroy him. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." Joseph's ability to read divine symbols was not merely a personal talent. It was a doorway into a deeper dialogue with the unseen. Each dream he interpreted was more than a prediction. It was an act of translation, turning the language of the soul into guidance that could shape real-world decisions. This gift required both sensitivity and courage, because the truths he revealed often carried consequences for entire nations. In decoding those messages, Joseph was refining a skill that would later become central to the Christ soul's mission, perceiving the hidden patterns beneath the surface of events and recognizing the spiritual meaning in every circumstance. This way of seeing the world was transformative. It meant that nothing was random, that even in moments of apparent chaos, there was a thread of purpose waiting to be uncovered. That perspective changes how one reacts to adversity. Instead of being crushed by injustice, Joseph allowed it to deepen his understanding and sharpen his insight. This mindset, the willingness to trust the higher order even when the immediate picture was unclear, would become a cornerstone of Jesus' own teachings, urging others to see beyond what the eyes can perceive. Yet, among all the lessons of that lifetime, none was as defining as forgiveness. When the famine brought his brothers to Egypt, desperate and unaware of his identity, Joseph stood in a position of absolute power. In that moment, he could have mirrored their betrayal, repaying pain with pain. But the decision he made instead reshaped the entire trajectory of his story. He chose to forgive, to provide for them, and to restore the bond that had been severed. This was more than an act of kindness. It was a conscious choice to end a cycle of harm that could have stretched through generations. Cayce's readings suggest that this was not a passing moral victory, but a deep spiritual imprint. Forgiveness, in its purest form, is not about forgetting the wrong. It is about transforming the meaning of the wrong so it no longer holds power over the heart. Joseph's decision to release resentment was a rehearsal for the radical compassion Jesus would later model, loving even those who nailed him to a cross. Behind the scenes, this experience anchored a truth that the Christ soul would carry forward, that the greatest power is not in control, but in the ability to liberate others from the weight of their own actions. Forgiveness creates a space where transformation becomes possible, both for the one who forgives and for the one who is forgiven. It is not passive, it is the most active, intentional form of love there is. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the journey was about to enter a chapter where the Christ soul's obedience to divine will would be tested against the pressures of leadership, warfare, and the constant temptation to use power for personal gain. Put down, "This makes sense to me." Guiding Egypt through famine was more than an exercise in resource management. It was a living metaphor for the kind of nourishment the Christ soul would one day offer in a far deeper sense. Joseph wasn't only distributing grain, he was safeguarding life itself, ensuring that hope didn't wither in the long season of scarcity. This role carried the same essence as the future words of Jesus, who spoke of the bread of life that sustains not the body alone, but the soul. In both cases, provision was an act of love, meeting the most urgent needs while pointing toward a higher form of sustenance that could never run out. Yet the ability to serve in this way wasn't born in comfort. It was forged in the hidden chambers of hardship. The years Joseph spent in betrayal, slavery, and imprisonment could have easily broken his spirit. Instead, they became the crucible in which his faith was tempered, each trial stripping away what was unnecessary and sharpening what was essential. Cayce's readings portray this as deliberate preparation, a behind-the-scenes shaping of the soul's resilience for the challenges yet to come. This is the hidden truth about spiritual strength. It rarely arrives fully formed. It is built piece by piece, in moments where surrender to fear would be the easier choice. Joseph's endurance was not passive. It was an active decision to trust that even the most difficult circumstances were part of a larger design. This mindset transformed his setbacks into stepping stones, each one leading him closer to the place where his gifts would be fully realized. The parallels to the later life of Jesus are striking. Just as Joseph faced the temptation to use his power for personal advantage, whether in Pharaoh's court or over his brothers, Jesus, too, would confront the allure of turning divine authority toward self-serving ends. Both chose the harder path, to use their position solely for the benefit of others, aligning each decision with a purpose beyond themselves. It's a form of leadership that is rare, because it requires constant awareness of the impact every choice will have on those you serve. And perhaps most significantly, Joseph's journey instilled a capacity for unwavering faith under pressure. His life demonstrated that spiritual authority is not granted simply by position or title. It is earned through the willingness to remain steady when everything familiar has been stripped away. This was the training that would enable the Christ soul, in the life of Jesus, to endure rejection, injustice, and even death without allowing bitterness to take root. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic because the next chapter would see the Christ soul step into a role where the battles were not only for land and people, but for the very alignment of human will with divine intention. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." When the Christ soul returned as Joshua, the path shifted into terrain that demanded both courage and precision. History often remembers him as the warrior who led the Israelites into the Promised Land. But Cayce's readings peel back the surface to reveal a far more intricate role. Beneath the image of a military leader was the mind of a spiritual scribe, a custodian of sacred knowledge whose mission extended beyond conquest. His victories were not only measured in territory gained, but in the preservation and continuation of divine law at a time when the community's identity was still fragile and forming. One of the most fascinating revelations from Cayce is that Joshua's mission included completing the writings attributed to Moses. After Moses' passing, there remained portions of the Torah to be recorded, passages that included accounts Moses could not have written about himself. Joshua, attuned to a higher frequency of awareness, received these through what Cayce called psychic dictation. It was a form of deep spiritual alignment, a channeling of wisdom that flowed not from his own intellect but from the consciousness of the departed prophet. This was not merely transcription, it was stewardship of a message meant to guide generations, ensuring the continuity of a covenant that bound the people to their higher purpose. Behind the scenes, this reveals a different kind of leadership, one that understood the weight of spiritual inheritance. Joshua's role was as much about protecting the integrity of divine instruction as it was about rallying people in times of conflict. In him, the Christ soul was refining the skill of holding absolute obedience to a higher will, even when the immediate demands of the world pulled in other directions. It was a delicate balance, managing the tangible realities of leading a nation through uncertainty, while guarding the intangible essence of their spiritual path. The act of completing Moses' writings also speaks to the Christ soul's evolving mindset. It wasn't enough to live in connection with divine truth. That truth had to be preserved in a way that others could access long after the moment had passed. This echoes the work of Enoch, who documented spiritual laws in a distant era, and foreshadows the teachings of Jesus, whose words would be carried far beyond the hills of Galilee into every corner of the world. Joshua's position demanded discipline, foresight, and an unwavering trust in guidance that often defied logic. Whether in the heat of battle or in the stillness of writing, his decisions were anchored in a deeper awareness that the mission was not his alone. It was part of a much greater unfolding. This understanding shaped his leadership into something enduring, not because it was perfect in human terms, but because it was aligned with the hidden architecture of divine purpose. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next layer of Joshua's journey reveals that the battles he fought on the outside were mirrors of the greater battles every soul must face within. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Joshua's campaigns, often remembered as military victories, carried a meaning far deeper than the chronicles of warfare suggest. Cayce described them as living symbols of the inner struggle that every soul must eventually face, the confrontation with the forces within that resist transformation, the cities to be taken, the walls to be brought down, the enemies to be driven out, all reflected the stubborn habits, fears, and desires that keep a person from entering their own promised land of spiritual clarity. Seen through this lens, Joshua's victories were not merely about territory. They were about clearing the inner landscape so that divine purpose could take root without obstruction. This perspective changes everything about how we interpret his role. Each battle was a mirror, a physical enactment of an invisible process. And just as no conquest was achieved without strategy, persistence, and faith, no inner transformation comes without discipline, conscious choice, and a willingness to face the parts of ourselves we'd rather avoid. This was the hidden truth embedded in Joshua's journey. That real victory begins long before the outward results appear, in the decision to confront what stands between you and your highest calling. Perhaps the most defining quality Joshua developed was complete obedience to divine guidance. In Cayce's view, this wasn't blind submission. It was a cultivated trust in a higher intelligence that saw further than he ever could. Sometimes that guidance defied reason, as in the fall of Jericho, where the strategy was not brute force, but a ritual of marching and silence followed by the sound of trumpets. To anyone focused solely on logic, it would have seemed absurd. Yet Joshua followed without hesitation, because he had learned through experience that surrender to divine instruction always brought the right outcome, even if the path was unconventional. This kind of obedience is not passive, it is active alignment. It requires a mindset that values purpose over preference, truth over comfort. And in that, Joshua was unknowingly preparing for a moment centuries later, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus would face his own ultimate test of surrender. The words, "Not my will, but thine be done," were not born in a single night. They were the culmination of lifetimes spent learning how to yield fully to divine will, while standing in the center of life's most intense pressures. Behind the scenes, Joshua's leadership was also about teaching those around him to trust that same higher direction. His people had to learn that their safety and success didn't come from numbers, weapons, or human strength, but from their willingness to remain in alignment with a greater plan. This was not just a lesson for them, it was a truth the Christ soul would carry forward into his own mission, where faith, not force, would be the key to transformation. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because Joshua's work with the 12 tribes carried a symbolic weight that reached far beyond his own lifetime, echoing into the formation of the 12 disciples and the spiritual structure they would represent. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." Organizing the 12 tribes was more than a matter of politics or logistics. It was a spiritual act of alignment. Each tribe held its own strengths, traditions, and challenges, and Joshua's role was to ensure they found their place in the greater whole without losing their individual identity. This was about creating harmony from diversity, a living structure in which every part served the collective purpose. In this way, Joshua was laying the groundwork for a pattern the Christ soul would later repeat with the 12 disciples, each one representing a facet of human consciousness that needed to be refined, guided, and integrated into a unified mission. The hidden truth here is that 12 was never just a number. It was a symbol, a reflection of completeness and balance, of all aspects working together toward a single divine aim. Joshua understood that if even one tribe strayed from its purpose, the stability of the whole would be at risk. This awareness required more than leadership. It demanded deep insight into human nature, the ability to see both the strengths and weaknesses of each group, and the wisdom to position them in ways that honored their unique role while protecting the unity of the nation. In fulfilling this task, Joshua embodied a principle that Jesus would later articulate to his own followers: to be gentle as a dove and wise as a serpent. It's a balance that few achieve, because it requires holding two seemingly opposite qualities at once. Gentleness without wisdom can be naive, easily manipulated. Wisdom without gentleness can be cold, alienating those it seeks to guide. Joshua learned to speak with compassion while standing firm in truth, to welcome with open arms while guarding against influences that could derail the mission. This duality was not an act or a strategy. It was the natural outgrowth of a mindset that valued both mercy and discernment as essential tools for transformation. His compassion kept him connected to those he led, ensuring they felt seen and supported. His wisdom ensured that decisions were not driven by emotion alone, but by a clear vision of the long-term impact. In many ways, these qualities prepared the Christ soul for the intricate balance Jesus would later have to strike, offering unconditional love while never compromising the integrity of his message. Behind the scenes, Joshua's work with the 12 tribes was also a study in trust. He had to trust that each group could grow into its role, that the structure he built would endure even after his direct leadership ended. This was the same trust Jesus would place in his disciples, knowing that the true measure of his work would be what they carried forward when he was no longer physically among them. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because Joshua's final lessons as a leader would weave together everything the Christ soul had been gathering across lifetimes: resilience, compassion, discipline, and vision, preparing for the moment when these qualities would converge in the life that would change the world. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." Looking back across these 5 extraordinary lifetimes, it becomes clear they were not separate stories but chapters in a single, carefully crafted curriculum. Each incarnation added a vital layer, preparing the Christ soul for a mission that would demand every ounce of wisdom, strength, and compassion it had gained. It's the kind of preparation that doesn't happen by accident. It's intentional, like a masterwork being slowly carved, each chisel stroke shaping the final form. In the life of Amelius, the soul's journey began with an understanding of responsibility on a scale most of us can hardly imagine. This was leadership in its purest sense, not about controlling others, but about guiding the evolution of an entire species. Amelius looked at humanity not as a scattered collection of individuals, but as a living whole, each part connected to the other, each decision carrying consequences for generations to come. This was cosmic responsibility, a leadership rooted in service to all, not just to the few. Such a perspective changes the way choices are made. When you carry the Zan awareness that your actions ripple through time, your mindset shifts. Every decision becomes more deliberate, more conscious, because you're not only thinking about the immediate impact, but the long arc of the journey. This is a level of awareness that few reach in a single lifetime, which is why it had to be lived, tested, and reinforced over many. The seeds planted in Atlantis were not simply about the creation of the human form. They were about creating a framework where spiritual growth could flourish. It required vision, patience, and the humility to know that true leadership is about empowering others to rise, not binding them to dependence. Amelius embodied this, setting the tone for every future incarnation to follow. From that point forward, the Christ soul would carry this understanding like a compass, steering through vastly different circumstances, but always guided by the same underlying truth, that leadership, at its highest, is an act of guardianship over the potential of others. Whether as a spiritual teacher, a priest-king, a savior in times of famine, or a commander of tribes, this was the constant thread. And here lies a hidden truth that echoes into our own lives. cosmic responsibility isn't reserved for great figures in history. On a smaller scale, each of us shapes the environment around us, influencing how others grow, think, and see themselves. Our words, our actions, our presence can either expand someone's potential or diminish it. That is leadership, whether we recognize it or not. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next stage in this divine curriculum would show how the Christ soul learned to translate the vastness of divine wisdom into a form that could be carried, remembered, and shared across generations. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." From Amelius's vast sense of cosmic responsibility, the journey moved into the life of Enoch, where the focus shifted from shaping the human framework to preserving the truths that would guide it. Enoch understood that wisdom, no matter how profound, is fragile if it's left only to memory. Words fade, teachings are distorted, and over time the essence can be lost entirely. His role was not simply to teach in the moment, but to safeguard the message so it could survive centuries, perhaps millennia, until humanity was ready to hear it again. This required a different kind of vision, a long-range mindset that saw beyond personal recognition. Writing was not about leaving his name attached to great works. It was about creating vessels for truth that would outlive him. In doing so, Enoch became a bridge between ages, allowing future generations to drink from the same well of understanding he had drawn from. This was a deliberate act of spiritual foresight, and it planted the seed for the written traditions that would anchor Jesus's later teachings in the physical world. Then, in the life of Melchizedek, the Christ soul took another crucial step, learning how to embody authority without being consumed by it. As priest-king, Melchizedek carried the weight of both governance and sacred service, two roles that often compete for dominance. It would have been easy to lean on the power of kingship alone, enforcing order through command, or to retreat into purely spiritual duties, leaving worldly matters to others. But the lesson here was integration, holding both roles in balance so that neither corrupted the other. Authority with humility is not a natural pairing for most leaders. It demands constant self-awareness, the willingness to make decisions that serve the whole even when they come at personal cost, and the ability to lead without placing oneself above those being led. Melchizedek's reign reflected this balance, showing that true authority is rooted not in dominance, but in stewardship. This balance would become one of the most defining features of Jesus's ministry, teaching with absolute confidence while still washing the feet of his disciples. The hidden truth running through these lives is that leadership, in its highest form, is less about control and more about creating conditions in which others can rise. Enoch ensured they would have the wisdom to guide them. Melchizedek ensured they would have the structure and example to inspire them. Both strands would weave directly into the fabric of the Christ mission, where the preservation of truth and the embodiment of service would stand side by side. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the next phase in this divine curriculum brought the Christ soul into the fires of personal hardship, where compassion was not an abstract ideal, but something forged through betrayal, loss, and the choice to love anyway. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." In the life of Joseph, the Christ soul entered a crucible that would temper one of the most essential qualities for the mission ahead: compassion that is not born from theory, but from lived experience. Betrayal, false accusations, imprisonment, and long seasons of isolation could have easily hardened his heart. Instead, these very trials became the soil where empathy took root. Joseph learned to look into the eyes of those who had wronged him and see not enemies, but fellow souls caught in their own struggles and limitations. This was compassion sharpened by pain, forgiveness forged in the heat of personal loss. It was the kind of mercy that could only emerge when love is chosen over resentment, even when the wounds are still fresh. The hidden truth behind Joseph's journey is that suffering, when met with openness rather than bitterness, expands the capacity to understand others on a profound level. Every injustice he endured became a mirror, reflecting the fears and flaws that drive human behavior. This allowed him to meet others without judgment, to offer help without expecting repayment. Such compassion is not passive. It is a conscious decision to break the cycle of harm, a choice that would later echo through Jesus' own words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Then, in the life of Joshua, the lesson turned toward another form of mastery, unwavering obedience to divine will. This was not the obedience of blind submission, but the kind born from trust earned over time, the kind that knows every instruction from a higher source carries a purpose beyond immediate understanding. Joshua faced moments where logic and strategy would have dictated one path, yet he followed another because the divine command was clear. Whether marching silently around the walls of Jericho or leading the people into unfamiliar territory, his faith in the guidance he received became second nature. Such obedience demands a specific mindset, a willingness to set aside personal preference, ambition, or fear in order to align fully with a greater design. For Joshua, this wasn't about suppressing his will, it was about refining it, until it moved in harmony with divine intention. This discipline would later be critical for Jesus, whose own path would lead him to the ultimate act of surrender in Gethsemane, where obedience meant embracing sacrifice for the sake of love. Together, Joseph's compassion and Joshua's obedience formed a powerful synergy in the Christ soul's preparation. One softened the heart so that power could be wielded without cruelty. The other strengthened the will so that love could be expressed without compromise. Both required a depth of transformation that could not be reached through comfort alone. Now I want to go even deeper into this topic, because when we weave together the lessons of all these lifetimes, a hidden architecture begins to emerge, one that reveals the deliberate shaping of a soul for the most transformative mission in history. Write in the comments, "I'm also on this path." The journey of the Christ soul across these lifetimes is not an isolated phenomenon. It is, in many ways, a magnified reflection of the same process every soul undergoes. While most of us may not live as rulers, prophets, or biblical figures, the essence of the path is remarkably similar. Each challenge we face, each trial that tests our resolve, is part of a curriculum tailored to prepare us for the work we came here to do. The difficulties aren't random. They are precise, sometimes painfully so, shaping qualities we will one day need when our own moment of purpose arrives. This hidden truth reframes the way we see hardship. Instead of obstacles meant to block us, they become tools meant to forge us. Just as Joseph's betrayal prepared him for compassion, or Joshua's battles taught him surrender, our personal struggles, whether in relationships, careers, health, or inner conflicts, are refining us for something beyond what we can currently see. The transformation is often quiet, taking place behind the scenes, until one day we find ourselves in a position where everything we've endured suddenly makes sense. Cayce's readings go even further, suggesting that many of the souls who walked alongside these great figures in the past are returning now, drawn back together by the threads of unfinished work. This is not nostalgia, it is purpose. These ancient souls, carrying echoes of those earlier eras, are here to help anchor a new age of spiritual understanding, one where humanity steps more fully into the awareness of its divine nature. The familiarity you might feel toward certain ideas, places, or even people could be the whisper of that shared history, surfacing again to remind you of why you are here. The impact of such a return is profound. It means that the currents moving through our time are not accidental. They are part of a larger orchestration that spans millennia. Just as the Christ soul's lifetimes built toward a singular mission, the collective presence of these returning souls builds toward a global transformation. The choices made now, individually and collectively, are setting the tone for what comes next in the human story. This is where personal responsibility deepens. If we are indeed part of a continuing tapestry woven through multiple ages, then our decisions today carry the weight of that legacy. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, every choice to align with truth contributes to the momentum of this larger journey. And while the stage may look different from ancient Egypt or the fields of Canaan, the essence of the work remains the same: to live in such a way that the divine finds clear expression through us. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because the final revelation in Cayce's account is that the qualities developed through the Christ soul's lifetimes are not just historical artifacts. They are the blueprint for what is possible in every human being. Write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." The culmination of all these lifetimes, with their victories and trials, was not simply the story of one extraordinary soul. It was the unveiling of what is possible for every human being. Perfect love in human form, what Cayce described as the Christ consciousness, is not meant to be an unreachable ideal reserved for a single figure in history. It is a living template, a model of what we are all capable of when the qualities cultivated over lifetimes are brought into harmony. Responsibility, wisdom, service, compassion, and obedience to love are not abstract virtues. They are the raw materials of transformation, forged in the decisions we make every day. This is the hidden truth that turns the story inward. The Christ consciousness is not a distant relic. It's a frequency, a state of awareness that can awaken in you at any moment you choose to align with it. You touch it every time you choose understanding over judgment, truth over convenience, forgiveness over resentment. And the more you choose it, the more it becomes your natural state. That is how divine qualities stop being lofty ideals and start becoming lived realities. The impact of living this way ripples far beyond what you can see, just as the actions of the Christ soul in one life carried forward into the next, shaping the unfolding mission. The choices you make now set into motion currents that will flow into the lives you touch, and perhaps even into lifetimes yet to come. The journey is both deeply personal and profoundly collective. Your transformation is never just your own. It becomes part of the larger evolution of consciousness on this planet. When Cayce spoke of these ancient incarnations, he wasn't only offering a biography of the soul who became Jesus. He was revealing a roadmap for spiritual development, a behind-the-scenes look at how the qualities necessary for divine expression are cultivated over time. It's not an instant awakening. It's a process of refinement that happens in the fires of experience, in the quiet discipline of service, and in the vulnerable openness of love. And this is where the story becomes less about history and more about possibility. You are not outside of this narrative, looking in. You are in it. The same path that shaped the Christ soul is available to you in your own way, through your own challenges and opportunities. Every relationship, every obstacle, every unexpected turn can be a chapter in your curriculum, if you choose to see it that way. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because understanding this template is one thing, but living it, moment by moment, is where the real transformation begins. Put down, "I'm also on this path." If you've stayed with me all the way through, I hope this journey has given you something meaningful to reflect on, maybe even a new way of looking at your own path. If you enjoy exploring these kinds of insights and finding the deeper patterns behind the stories, you might want to subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And since you made it here to the end, let's make it our little sign. Leave a comment saying, "I'm with you until the end." I'll know you were part of the full journey. If this conversation resonated with you, a quick like on the video is always appreciated. It helps keep this space alive for more of these exchanges. And if you're ready to keep going, there's a video right here that complements this topic beautifully. Click it, and let's continue together over there.